It's a real pleasure to be here in this very, very beautiful space, and thank you all very much for coming. So, becoming like God, Plato and ethical ascent. My reason for wanting to explore this is that I believe Plato's account of how we can diminish the gap between mortal and divine has much to teach all of us, whether or not we ascribe to a notion of divinity ourselves. And for the record, I would class myself as an agnostic. If atheism is having a firm belief that there is no God, agnosticism rather is not having a belief that there is a God, but also not having a firm belief that there is no God either. In particular, I would suggest that by exploring Plato's account of how we can assimilate ourselves to God, we will discover some powerful reasons concerning both why there should be dialogue between believers and non-believers, and also how such dialogue might fruitfully be conducted. Now, before we address ourselves to ethical ascent in Plato, however, we need to outline two general points. Firstly, ancient Greek philosophy is a very helpful starting point for any ethical or religious discussion because, although many Greek philosophers were profoundly religious, and Plato chief amongst them, in the classical and Hellenistic periods, none of them espoused any of the current dominant world religions. In the case of Christianity and Islam, they obviously couldn't, and in the case of Judaism, they happened not to. So they allow us to debate profound religious and ethical issues in a way which, to some extent, avoids contemporary tensions. Ancient Greek philosophy provides a shared cultural space where people can discuss without feeling that their own religious identities are being so immediately threatened. Now, secondly, turning to Plato in particular, one of the main reasons he is such an apt resource for interfaith and faith-secular dialogue is that, of course, he writes in dialogue form himself, with various positions being taken by a wide cast of characters, never, we may note, by Plato himself, who only refers to himself in the third person twice in the whole body of his work. Now, some of the views these characters express, admittedly, may strike us as extremely authoritarian, such as some of those voiced by the character of Socrates in the Republic, or the Athenian stranger in Plato's last work, The Laws. But it is not clear to me that Plato himself is authoritarian, at least not in any uncomplicated way. After all, the Republic is a work of art which would almost certainly be banned, or at least very heavily censored, in the ideally just state that it purports to describe. It simply does not meet the censorship criteria that the character of Socrates lays down. So the resulting and often ironic distance between Plato the author and his characters positively invites us to discuss and debate. It creates a space for the reader to enter, including contemporary readers. So what views on the divine did Plato inherit? The gods of Greek myth that we find in Homer and in many of the lyric and tragic poets are often capricious, vain, jealous, and vindictive. Rumour has it that some of them wore orange wigs and hung out in locker rooms, but we will let that pass. The best a mere mortal can hope for is to try not to anger them. And this means knowing your lowly human place and not being guilty of the sin of hubris, not challenging them, or trying to close the gap between them and you in any way. Quote, "Mortals should think mortal thoughts," writes the lyric poet Pindar in the mid-5th century BC. And this line of thought has continued to have adherents throughout the West. For instance, consider these lines by Alexander Pope. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan, the proper study of mankind is man. Now, Plato's understanding of the divine is completely and radically different. For a start, although he often keeps Athenian politicians sweet by talking of the gods in the plural, in his most profound passages of theological and philosophical reflection, he very often just talks of God in the singular. I think there's pretty clear evidence that Plato was privately a monotheist. And crucially, this single God of Plato's is rational. There is a rational controlling intelligence, nous in the Greek, which has rationally designed and providentially ordered the cosmos according to the laws of mathematics and physics. As far as Plato is concerned, we do not have to choose between religion and science or between religion and philosophy. Indeed, the more the cosmos can be shown to be run along mathematical lines, the more that is proof of God in action. And for the later Stoics, who were heavily influenced by Plato, these mathematical and physical laws may actually be God. That may be what God is for the Stoics. For evidence of Plato's views on this, there are many, many dialogues. You could look at Phaedo 97, Cratylus 400, Philebus, the Laws. Now, just as importantly, human reason is akin to this divine controlling intelligence. Again, Republic, Timaeus, Philebus, there are many examples. The Philebus example is particularly interesting, as it talks of there being a small spark of cosmic fire within each one of us, an image which goes back to the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, well, not that he knew he was pre-Socratic, obviously, and goes forward to the Stoics. Our reason is the divine element within us, and it follows that humans both can and should try to develop and hone their rational powers as much as possible. This is the essence of the, quote, assimilation to God as far as is humanly possible, unquote, which we are told is our chief human task at Theaetetus 176, a very famous passage, but again the same message is given in passages in the Republic, the Timaeus, the Laws. So Pindar may have thought that mortals should think mortal thoughts, and that trying to exceed those boundaries is hubristic and dangerous. But for Plato, our divinely appointed mission is to exercise our divinely sourced reason, to try to scale the heights. I quote, "We should think of the most authoritative part of our soul, i.e. reason, as a guardian spirit." The word here in the Greek is daimon, and we might at the end of this time come back to these intermediary spirits called daimons. So we should think of the most authoritative part of our soul as a guardian spirit given to each of us by God, living in the summit of the body, which can properly be said to lift us from the earth towards our home in heaven, as if we were a heavenly and not an earthbound plant. For where the soul first grew into being, from there the divine part attaches us by the head to heaven, like a plant by its roots, and keeps our body upright. That's from the Timaeus 90. However, and this is a vital move in our argument, having our rational powers and becoming like God is not just a matter of contemplating the mathematically ordered heavens, important though that is. It also involves reflecting on and questioning all matters of import. This is one of the reasons why in the Apology, Socrates, in the defense speech he gives when he's on trial before the Athenian democracy in 399 BC, this is one of the reasons why Socrates is able to portray his work of engaging Athenians in debate about key concepts as fulfillment of a divine mission from Apollo. And furthermore, the concepts under scrutiny are not only ethical and aesthetic, they also include the nature of the divine itself and the proper human attitude towards it. We should be asking questions about God. So witness the seminal discussion, which many of you will know in the Euthyphro, about whether things are called holy because they are loved by God, or whether God loves things because they are holy. As the dialogue unfolds, it is strongly suggested that the latter is the case. And it is further implied that holiness is the assistance humans give to the gods in producing the noble product of human virtue, which would in turn suggest that Socrates' practice of questioning his fellow humans is indeed a holy task. He didn't convince the Athenians, of course, they put him to death via hemlock, but on the whole, history has vindicated him, though not everybody. Nietzsche thought he didn't die nearly soon enough. Witness to the attempts to prove through a series of careful arguments the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo. And consider the attempt to persuade atheists through argument in the laws that A, the gods exist, B, they are incorruptible, and C, that they care for humankind. In all these cases, the ultimate aim is the salvation of the soul, of both the hearer and the speaker. But this can only be achieved through the development and proper use of the rational powers of both, because only reason can apprehend knowledge of the good and put it into effect. Now, this good I'm talking about, the word for that in Greek is agathon, and we're going to be coming back to that later. So in short, it is a key part of our divinely appointed task to ask questions about the divine. And that process will also involve asking questions about what our human limits really are, because perhaps it is part of the human condition to try to exceed normally accepted human boundaries, perhaps trying to transcend humanity as humanity is normally understood is in itself part of the human condition. Not that Plato thinks we can ever become completely divine, at least in this life. There are one or two passages which suggest that possibly at the moment of death or after death we might be able to ascend to true Godhead, but that's another issue. In this life it looks as if we can't ever quite cross over and become divine, but we can get fairly close. As a sort of mark of these of human humility, in the Apology, Socrates only lays claim to what he calls a kind of human wisdom. And in the Meno, Socrates says he couldn't absolutely swear to anything that they have just agreed about the immortality of the soul and its reincarnation. A particularly important and interesting passage is the Critias in the Critias 107. There, Critias says that whenever discussing divine matters, we must of necessity use representation, mimesis in the Greek, the mimetic art, and we must use comparison, apikasia in the Greek. In other words, our thinking about the divine must inevitably be metaphorical. And metaphor, of course, will always require interpretation, Platonic dialogue, The debate can never be finally closed. Now, at this point, we reach a potential problem, which the eagle-eared amongst you may have already spotted. I know nothing about the hearing capacities of eagles. Some of you may, but anyway, you get the point. It is all very well saying that we need to hone our rational powers if we are going to become more like God, but although Plato does believe that reason is innate in us, he also believes that our innate rational capacities do not begin to be properly actualized in any significant degree until we are older. He's not very explicit about this, maybe 8, 9, 10, that kind of age. And by this time, he also thinks bad habits may have set in, which may have made us hostile to welcoming and nurturing our emerging reason. And it may be very difficult to eradicate such bad habits. So the question is there anything that can be done for younger children to enable them to welcome reason when it does appear and want to develop it and its understanding of the good? Now, fortunately, the good, agathon, you remember in the Greek, is not the only Greek value term. And fortunately, too, the divine mathematical laws that govern the cosmos are not only appreciated by our reason, even if it is only our reason that can understand them for what they are and reflect on them and their goodness. So the mathematical laws that run the cosmos, yes, they can only be fully understood by reason, their beneficial nature can only be fully appreciated by reason, but there are other ways of appreciating the mathematical laws which organize the world. There is another key value term, the kalon in the Greek, which means beauty. And we can apprehend beauty long before the actualization of our rational powers. Now, for Plato, beauty is chiefly an objective notion. Yes, of course, we have a subjective response to it, but he thinks it's not just up to us as individuals or even as cultures to decide what is truly beautiful. He thinks, and it's not a fashionable thought, but it's an interesting thought, he thinks that some things are truly beautiful rather than just appearing so. And the principles that account for this true objective beauty are the same mathematical principles of ratio and proportion and harmony that account for the good, the agathon. So though the concept of beauty may require reason to analyze it and understand it, beautiful sounds, beautiful sights, and so on can be appreciated and enjoyed from birth. In fact, even before birth, there's a wonderfully bonkers passage in his last work, The Laws, where he gives this sort of terrific description of pregnant women. He says there must be compulsory dancing classes for pregnant women so that the embryo inside them can imbue a sense of rhythm and harmony. Unfortunately, he's not thinking about the health of the mother in this. He's thinking entirely about the ethical and aesthetic and spiritual development of the embryo, but still. So, I mean, he'd have been right in there with listening to Mozart and Bach and playing them to your baby in the womb. Furthermore, beauty is not just about something which can be appreciated by our senses. So far we've talked about what we would call sensible beauty, aesthetic beauty, the kind of beauty that you appreciate through your eyes, ears, sense of smell, and so on. There is also, in Greek, generally in Plato, an internal moral beauty. The kalon, this word beautiful, can also refer to things that are fine and noble and honourable. And again, here too, mathematical notions of ratio, proportion, and harmony are the key. So, for instance, a moral virtue such as justice is, I summarize very briefly, he wrote books on this, is all about the correct proportional distribution of goods and in general giving everybody their proportionate due. And this kind of beauty too can be appreciated very early on, perhaps not actually in the womb, but certainly by young toddlers. Plato completely understands the 2-year-old furiously protesting it's not fair if they are given a smaller slice of cake than another 2-year-old. Now, this pre-rational apprehension of beauty, moral beauty, is possible because it is the preserve of another part of Plato's notion of a tripartite soul, a tripartite psyche. Plato does not think our soul can just be divided into reason and appetites. He thinks there is a third part, an intermediary part, which he calls the thumos, the spirited element, which is concerned with honour and respect, including our self-respect. It's concerned with our standing in the world. How do you acquire honour? You do the things that your society already regards as honourable, hence the connection with at least accepted moral values. In fact, I think that this third part of the soul, this thumos, may also be what apprehends aesthetic beauty in Plato, but that's a topic for another paper. So the implications of all this for education and our ethical ascent are profound. Even before reason begins to emerge and become available for training, very young children, and in some cases even embryos, will need to be surrounded by beautiful sounds, and then when they're born, beautiful sights as well, beautiful smells. And Plato argues very powerfully in the Republic, where he's outlining his blueprint for an ideally just society, that very great attention needs to be paid to public music, architecture, town planning, sculpture, even home furnishings. Very young children, he says, need to grow up surrounded by beauty in many different forms, so they imbibe a sense of grace and harmony and proportion, so that when reason comes to develop later, they will welcome reason as a friend. Now, the key here, of course, is that reason and our sense of moral beauty and our sense of aesthetic beauty, they're all connected. They're all latching on to the mathematical physical laws that govern the cosmos. They just latch on to those laws and appreciate them in different ways. Reason is able to think about those laws and analyze them and reflect on them and make use of them. Our sense of moral nobility and our sense of beauty don't have that level of understanding, but they're attracted to these laws. They're attracted to proportion and harmony and grace, and they appreciate it and love it in different ways. That is why training a young child to appreciate what Plato, controversially, believes to be truly beautiful things will, first of all, help that child develop a moral sense. They will internalize those proportionate laws into their psyche, and they will take beauty deeply inside themselves and acquire a sense of grace and proportion and harmony within their own souls. And that, in turn, will make them in tune with their reason when it develops when they're a few years older. And they will want to then appreciate what reason is urging them to do, namely to go further in their exploration of these laws that govern the cosmos, to understand them at a deeper and more analytical and more philosophic level. So there is this very, very profound connection between aesthetic beauty, moral beauty, and rational goodness. And it's that allows the human, the very young human, the human child, to begin their ethical ascent from, even in the womb. You don't have to wait until you're a teenager and you can start going up a rational ladder. Now, I think I've got, if I can just have 5 more minutes, is that okay? And then we'll take questions. It doesn't stop there, because Plato also argues, and he argues this chiefly in another very, very famous dialogue called the Symposium, which is about erotic love and its connection with beauty, both moral and aesthetic beauty. Plato argues that as we get older still, and our capacity for erotic desire and attraction develops, our erotic desire will also latch onto beautiful objects. So whether eros guides us in a good and beneficial direction or in a harmful direction will depend on whether we have latched onto what Plato regards as truly beautiful objects, both aesthetically beautiful to our senses and morally beautiful. If eros is properly trained in that way, it will then work in harmony with our reason, because they're actually after the same thing. They're after, the reason is after the good, our sense of what beauty is, of course, after, and our erotic desire is after the beautiful, but actually the good and the beautiful are really basically both the same thing. They're the mathematical laws that underpin the cosmos, which are at the very least divinely ordained, may even be God itself. So if all goes well with the training of our reason and the training of our aesthetic sensibility and later our erotic sensibilities, then reason and emotion, or reason and desire, can work in harmony. And at this point, we might be ready to ascend one of the most famous images in the whole of Plato, which many of you will have heard of, the ladder of love, the ladder of eros, erotic love, in Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, the banquet. What we get here is, first of all, we start off falling in love with one beautiful body. We're just attracted by the exterior appearance of one beautiful body. But then our reason steps in and says, well, there's really no particular difference between one body and another body. If you love one body, you might just as well love them all. The sort of the Mick Jagger approach to erotic love. So you extend your erotic sympathies and understanding to embracing all beautiful bodies in the world. But then you realize that actually people's souls are much more beautiful than their bodies, that beauty is more quintessentially instantiated in souls than in bodies. And so you turn your attention onto beautiful souls, and you start loving all the beautiful souls in the world. But then you think, well, actually, what is it that makes souls beautiful? It's because they are exhibiting moral laws and guided by moral principles. And actually, what's really beautiful, more purely beautiful than a beautiful human soul, are the laws and principles themselves, the moral laws themselves. So you start turning your attention to loving the moral laws. And then you think, well, what makes these moral laws beautiful? What really helps me get to grips with them? It's knowledge. It's knowledge of all kinds of knowledge. That's what's really wonderful. Wisdom. So you start loving all wisdom. And eventually, at the very top of the ladder, you have this glimpse, a sort of epiphanic vision of the form. You don't need to bother about forms like this, a perfect instantiation of absolute beauty itself. We don't need to go through all, there are many, many, many questions and problems with this ladder. All we need for tonight is that Plato thinks it shows our aesthetic sensibility, our emotional response to moral good beauty, and our rational understanding of goodness all working hand in hand. And we go up the ladder together, but only if our reason and our emotions and our moral and aesthetic sensibilities have been properly trained. And as a final really intriguing note, this eros, which is leading us, guiding us up the ladder of love, Plato says it's not just an experience. It's not just a pathos, something that you undergo. He says it's also a daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N, if you were going to transliterate it. Not the same as demons in Christian thought, though Christian demons were a sort of spin-off of bad daimons. These daimons in ancient Greece, they're intermediary spirits. They're neither mortal nor immortal. They are invisible, they act at a distance, but they interpenetrate the whole cosmos. And they help guide humans to the divine, and they help bring messages from the divine to humans. They act as messengers. And I will read you a very, very famous passage which has had a huge impact on, as we'll see in a minute, on not just Western philosophy and literature, but also Western science. So this is a passage in Plato's dialogue, the Symposium. It comes in 202 in that dialogue. And this mysterious priestess woman called Diotima, she probably didn't exist, we don't need to worry about her. She says, everything daimonic lies between the divine and mortal realms, its power being that of interpreting and conveying things from humans to gods and gods to humans, entreaties and sacrifices from the former, and commands and returns for sacrifices from the latter. Being in the middle, it fills in the space between them so that the whole is bound together into one continuum. So Plato is here giving us a vision of a cosmos where, though mortals never quite become immortal, they are connected to the immortal through these daimonic spirits, of which the chief daimonic spirit for human purposes is eros, erotic love. It's erotic love which, first of all, helps us to fall in love with beautiful bodies, but then helps us to fall in love with spiritual, inner, moral beauty as well, and which leads us to an understanding of the beautiful itself, which is in fact just the good itself in another guise. So it's erotic love, this daimonic spirit, which is helping the mortals to ascend, not quite to become divinities, but to get very close, because we have this vision of a cosmos, which is actually, we start off thinking it's all bits and pieces, it's all fragmented, but actually for Plato it is all connected by these mathematical laws, and we're helped to see the connections through erotic love in particular. Now this passage has an enormously rich history. I'll go through it here. It was hugely influential in Neoplatonic philosophy. It appears in Iamblichus and Porphyry, in Plotinus. It was picked up in the Renaissance by writers such as Ficino. And most interestingly of all, a lovely little postscript to end on. We know that when Newton got very fed up with Trinity College, Cambridge and academia, and we can all appreciate that, and sort of stumped off back to, I think it was Lincolnshire, to really immerse himself, not so much in what we would recognise as science, but in alchemy, and he studied ancient religions, and he studied ancient daimonology, and became and wrote a huge amount about ancient religion and ancient daimonology and alchemy. There's been some very, very interesting papers and studies written in the last few years, suggesting with quite good evidence, because we know that Newton knew about this work through Ficino in particular, that Newton's work that he was doing on forces, on invisible forces which interpenetrate the whole cosmos and act at a distance. There's been some very interesting work suggesting that his study of ancient daimonology, these forces such as eros connecting the cosmos together, might have influenced his thought there. So what we have tonight looked at is Plato's suggestions for how humans can ascend closer to the divine. We started off by looking at saying, yes, the key to that is to hone our rational powers, because our reason is given to us by God, and it requires us to explore everything, including the notion of the divine itself, and to ask questions about it. But we then said, well, what happens before reason develops properly in humans? How can you help guide humans towards reason? And we looked at the connections between the kind of good that reason studies in Plato and the notion of both physical and moral beauty, which we can apprehend before we understand the good. And we saw how Plato thinks that beauty is very closely connected to the good through mathematics. So if you can immerse a very, very young child, even an embryo, in beautiful sounds and later beautiful sights and so on, they can then imbibe that beauty inside themselves, and that harmony and proportion inside themselves, which will help them develop inner moral beauty, which will make them more receptive to rational reason when it comes along, and reason's quest for rational goodness. So we looked at Plato's account of that ascent, and we've seen how that has sparked off the imagination. I listed a few philosophers. We could have talked about Freud. We could have talked about many poets. That image has sparked off many imaginations, including a scientist like Newton, who, though he was a Christian, was a very eccentric kind of Christian in his own day, didn't believe in the Trinity and so on. And it helped, or arguably, I think persuasively, helped Newton explore his idea of a cosmos interpenetrated by invisible forces which connect the cosmos into a whole. So we saw how a picture of the cosmos, which started in Plato, can be reinterpreted, reinvented by later generations, whether they are religious or not. And why? Because Plato himself says that the language in which he writes about religion is inevitably metaphorical, because that's all humans can ever do when talking about the divine, which gives his images a very rich, resonant power, which I would argue lasts through the ages and can spark off people's imaginations and lead them into all sorts of different and fruitful directions. Thank you.